Thomas Jefferson is a man that many Americans do not need a history lesson on who he is. He was a founding father of the United States, chief author of the Declaration of Independence, and he was the third president of the United States. He was a very, very influential person in our early U.S. history. Over the decades, though, Jefferson as a person and his character has been looked back on and reevaluated, and rightfully so. One of the things that a lot of people like to look back on is how he had fathered kids with his slave Sally Hemings, which he is the father of those kids. That is not up for debate, and I am not going to debate it. I know a lot of people will say, like, oh, the evidence only shows that it was just a male member of the Jefferson party. Well, who was the man in the Jefferson family who was around her the most often and literally owned her? It's very clearly Jefferson based off of the DNA evidence and the circumstantial evidence, and that is not up for debate. He is also pointed to as one of the two people that started the two-party system we still see here today in America, and as much as I love Alexander Hamilton, he is directly responsible for the two-party system that we have here in America, because him and Jefferson's public feud in politics, they completely split politics apart with their beliefs, forming the Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Anti-Federalist, later the Democratic Republican Party, mainly led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. One big reason that I bring up Hamilton here today is because he is a big reason for what we are talking about here today. Now, as I had mentioned, Hamilton and Jefferson, they had a huge feud. They were bitter enemies till the very day that Hamilton died, and even after Hamilton died, Jefferson continued to drag him through the mud. Jefferson's disdain for Hamilton really stemmed from a lot of the idea that he felt like Hamilton was a monarchist and big government, something that Jefferson was very opposed to. Jefferson was more for a smaller government, to have the states be the more powerful ones, and for it to be more of an agrarian culture inside of America that led the industries. Hamilton was more for a big government and having the federal government be the central point of America and having it being very strong. Not only did he believe that Hamilton was for monarchy in America, he also believed that Hamilton was for a monarchy, quote-unquote, bottomed on corruption. In almost every single aspect of their lives, they were complete polar opposites, not even just politically, but personally. Hamilton grew up on the island of Nevis in the Caribbean, and his father abandoned them early on in life, and his mother died very shortly after, leaving him orphaned and poor. During the American Revolution, that's where George Washington first saw Hamilton, and he started to rise up and be able to show his worth to everybody, and started making a name for himself. Hamilton had to work for everything that he had. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson, he was born into a wealthy plantation family. His family had already collected a bunch of wealth due to all the plantations and land that they had owned. A lot of people try to say that Hamilton did own slaves, but I personally don't really believe it based off of what I've read and what I've researched. It just doesn't seem likely with who he was. He had also helped found the New York Manumission Society, which was a society that had pushed for abolition of the slaves. If it wasn't for Hamilton being so big in politics and well-known, I feel like Hamilton probably would have publicly held a stronger stance against slavery. A lot of people in politics, even today, they will take a more relaxed approach on what they truly believe to be able to protect their image and be able to further their political career.
I will do everything in my power to protect our LGBTQ citizens from the violence and oppression of a hateful foreign ideology. Believe me. We have removed the poison of critical race theory from our public schools, and I signed an order making it the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female. And our country will be woke no longer.
Because for Hamilton, if he had taken a public stance that he wanted to free all the slaves, that could have ruined his political career, especially early on in the United States history. Jefferson, on the other hand, he was very pro-slavery. To this day, he is still the president who has owned the most slaves in U.S. history. He had over 600 slaves at one point, most of them being at his estate Monticello in Virginia. While Hamilton was very public about his anti-slavery views, Jefferson was more private about them, privately calling it a moral depravity and that he supported the eventual emancipation of the slaves. Thomas Jefferson, as a political figure, is a very confusing figure because he would have such strong stances for something, and then as soon as he had that power, he would go against it. For example, if we look at the Louisiana Purchase, as I had said earlier, Thomas Jefferson was for very small government and didn't want the government to have a lot of power, yet he did one of the most powerful things that the government has ever done in history, completely doubling the size of the United States. Hamilton and Jefferson are two completely polarizing figures against each other, and they could not be any more different. Now, why exactly do I bring up this feud, you may be asking? Their feud is directly what leads to the main character of our story being in the position that he is. There are no official records for the date that James Callender was born, but we do know that he was born in Scotland in 1758. Growing up there, he did not get much of a formal education. He started working at a very young age. He had found himself acquiring a job as a sub-clerk in the Edinburgh Sassoon office. In this job is where Callender began to start putting pen to paper and start attacking his political opponents in the newspaper, many ways akin to what Alexander Hamilton was doing in the Americas. He was a nationalist of Scotland and a radical egalitarianist, and he had sought through his writings to bring down the wealthy and powerful men and put them down to size through his writings. Keeping in character with what he was doing and how he was attacking people in the press, he had a lot of issues with the employers that he had there and the employees there, so he had eventually gotten fired from the Sassoon. In order to avoid being prosecuted for these writings that he had been publishing, he decided to move across the pond into a brand new nation that had just gained their independence a couple years ago, known as the United States of America in 1792. Very quickly, Callender caught the eye of many high-ranking officials, including Thomas Jefferson, who decided to hire Callender onto Washington's payroll during the Washington administration. Jefferson had officially labeled Callender as the translator for him, but this is not what he had hired him for. Jefferson had seen Callender's writings, and he saw how well he could take down his opponents, and he knew just the thing he could do with that. Callender was used as a writer for the newspaper to undermine and attack the Federalist Party, who was spearheaded by Jefferson's sworn enemy, Alexander Hamilton. Just like Hamilton, he put pen to paper and started attacking all the Federalists that he could and all the people who opposed Jefferson, especially Alexander Hamilton. One of his most damning writings was in 1797, when he wrote A History of the United States for the year 1796. In this, he would expose Hamilton with incriminating evidence that he had had an adulterous affair with a woman named Maria Reynolds and had paid off her husband, James Reynolds, to keep it a secret. And he had made claims that Hamilton had used government money to cover up this scandal and embezzled government funds. Of course, Hamilton seen that this was published and he had seen everything that was being said about him, so he responded in the exact same way that any other sane person would do. He wrote a 97-page long pamphlet, later called the Reynolds pamphlet, where he had denied any accusations that he had used government money to cover up this scandal, but he had completely admitted to the adulterous affair that he had had. This whole affair that Hamilton had had, in the grand scheme of things, was not that big of a deal, and it never really was going to be a big deal, and it would eventually die out. But because he had responded to it so publicly and so massively, he completely blew the situation out of proportions. Even though Hamilton only had a few years left on his life at that point, it completely ruined his political career. Now that Jefferson and Callender had finally defeated their arch-nemesis Alexander Hamilton, they had their eyes set on their next Federalist target, President John Adams. John Adams had beaten Thomas Jefferson in the 1796 election to become the second ever United States president. Callender would attack John Adams in the press and would accuse him of being pro-monarchist and being in favor of a hereditary position for positions like the president or the Senate. Which they weren't entirely wrong about that. If you read the notes that people had taken about Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention, he came off as a very pro-monarchist person and someone who was in favor of having hereditary positions in the government. Callender's writings would prove to be successful again, as Thomas Jefferson would win the 1800 election and become the third president of the United States. James Callender wasn't exactly off scot-free, though. See, when John Adams was the president, he signed into law one of the worst laws we've ever had in the United States, the Alien and Sedition Act. The sedition part that specifically made it illegal for anybody to write anything against the government at all. Since James Callender was specifically writing against the President of the United States, John Adams, he had been charged and arrested for these writings. When Thomas Jefferson took office in March of 1801, he had pardoned everybody who was arrested under these acts, including James Callender. After everything that Callender had done to help Jefferson get into the position he had assumed that he would gain some kind of reward from that, something to say thank you for helping me get here. The position that he had specifically wanted to ask Jefferson for was to be the Postmaster General of Richmond, Virginia. So what he does is he approaches Thomas Jefferson about this. He asks him, hey, look at all this stuff that I've done for you. Look at all these writings I've done for you. Look at all the ways that I have attacked all these people for you and put them down to help you get to where you're at. Maybe I could get a little something in return and you can make me Postmaster General. Thomas Jefferson would not give him this position, and this would infuriate James Callender. After everything that he had did for Thomas Jefferson, this was how he was going to treat him? Jefferson at the very least should have realized that if you're going to piss anybody off, do not piss off the person that you've had right into the public to attack these people and actively bring people down. Callender would take his writings that he had used against the Federalists and flip it on Jefferson, where he would start attacking Jefferson in the press now. He had revealed that Jefferson had hired him on the Washington payroll to attack all these Federalists for years, and after all of Jefferson's supporters kept attacking him and started going after him and his wife, saying that Callender had left his wife to die in 1798, that was his final straw. You see, remember when I had mentioned how Thomas Jefferson was the father of Sally Hemings' kids? James Callender was the one who leaked that out. James Callender is the reason that we are aware that this affair had happened and he had had all these kids with his slave. When Callender revealed this to the public, luckily Jefferson, unlike Hamilton, knew not to write a big old pamphlet talking about how he had done it. He just kind of swept it under the rug and pretended that it didn't exist. Soon after, in July of 1803, the Supreme Court case, the People v. Crosswell, was beginning. The case was against Harry Crosswell, a political writer like Callender, who was being charged by the state of New York for his writings against many political leaders of the time, including the sitting President Jefferson. James Callender was slated to testify in this trial against the claims that he had undermined Washington's government by hiring him on the payroll, which he did. After all the years that Callender had worked alongside Jefferson, Callender had got a lot of dirt on Jefferson, so he was ready to completely reveal everything. Just a few days before he was set to testify against Jefferson in court, he was found drowned inside the James River. He was reportedly said to have been drunk that night and had drowned in 3 feet of water, being too drunk to save himself, and that's what the autopsy had also agreed with. Ever since I have heard this story about his whole death and everything surrounding it, I have never trusted it, and I have never been fully in agreement that it was just accidental. It just feels too perfect. Someone who had known Jefferson very well, who had decided to turn on him, who was about to testify in court against him, drowns in 3 feet of water just a couple of days before he's about to testify, reportedly too drunk. It just works out too perfectly for Jefferson. Just works out too perfectly. And especially knowing Jefferson, who he was as a character and a person, I do not put this past him at all to silence the people around him. I believe that Jefferson was very closely involved with whatever happened to James Callender. I think with the power that he had, he probably was able to find somebody who was willing to take him out. Even in death, James Callender still wasn't really remembered that much. James Callender was buried at the St. John's Episcopal Churchyard in Richmond, Virginia, with no pomp and circumstance, so much so that we don't even know where his body is. Even in the graveyard, he doesn't even have a tombstone or anything. We just know he's buried there, and that's about all we know. Even in death, he didn't get any kind of recognition at all. Jefferson actively did not want Callender to be remembered in the history books, and for the most part, he kind of succeeded in that. I've rarely ever seen anybody talk about this situation, and it's something that has really fascinated me for years, and something I wish a lot more people would talk about when it comes to Thomas Jefferson. We can both acknowledge everything that Thomas Jefferson did good in life and everything that Thomas Jefferson did bad in life. He had a lot of accomplishments, but a lot of flaws. Oh yeah, and by the way, that Harry Crosswell guy that was being taken to court, you know who his lawyer was? Alexander Hamilton. May the Hamilton and Jefferson feud never end.